The manhwa starts in a dark room where our unnamed protagonist is confused and terrified. He begins to use his flashlight to illuminate the dark space where he cannot see anything, and as he explores, he encounters a terrible and horrifying scene. Several student corpses are scattered throughout the room, some piled on top of each other. Tension and fear overwhelm him, causing him to jump back and drop his cell phone in fright. As he tries to recover from the shock, he begins to wonder what has happened, how much time has passed, and why the ambulance or police have not yet arrived at the scene. Suddenly, screams from the other side of a door jolt him out of his trance. The protagonist begins to walk through the dark place in search of help, using his flashlight to light the way. However, his search leads him to an unexpected place, as he is surprised to find a giant sign like the ones located on the exterior of buildings, indicating that he had been outside the whole time and not inside a building as he initially thought. Suddenly, a mocking laugh is heard behind him, and the protagonist asks, surprised and scared, who is there, while quickly turning around and pointing his flashlight in search of the origin of the laughter. For his bad or good luck, he finds nothing and no one but complete darkness and silence. And while looking for the origin of the laughter, he suddenly loses consciousness. When he wakes up after a short time, the protagonist begins to complain of a sudden and intense pain in his leg, fearing that he has twisted or fractured it. But looking down in search of the source of the pain, he discovers that his leg is covered with some kind of leeches that are feeding on his flesh. He quickly manages to get rid of them with screams, but his leg ends up wounded and full of holes, prompting him to search for medicine quickly. Fortunately, he finds a veterinary hospital near where he is. When he tries to open the door, he hears a murmur from the other side. Determined to get help, he begins to force the door to enter. It is then that someone suddenly grabs him from behind and covers his mouth, telling him to go with him and be quiet or he will die. The stranger manages to take the protagonist away from the door, but in the end, the protagonist manages to free himself. When he points his flashlight at the kidnapper, he discovers that it was a girl who claims to have saved his life. She also comments that it is rare to have found another survivor, and welcomes him to the city of Seoul, the city of hell. After welcoming him, the girl covers her eyes from the light as the protagonist never stops shining it in her face. She tells him to stop, to which the nervous protagonist apologizes and points his flashlight to the ground. The protagonist sees his leg, which is full of holes and bandages, and thanks her for helping him. After this, the protagonist asks the girl what all that was about and what was happening, to which she only replies that she cannot tell him, confusing our protagonist. The girl in red tells him not to get the wrong idea, and with a serious look and a cold tone, clarifies that she only helped him because they were both about to die. She tells him that if he has any questions, he should figure it out himself. Our protagonist just says he is okay while complaining that she is shining the flashlight directly in his face. Suddenly, both of them hear a mysterious noise, and as the protagonist asks what it was, the girl tells him to look up. They start to see a train falling from the sky just a few steps away from where they were, surprising both of them. But before they could react, the train falls on top of them, and everything goes dark again. The protagonist starts asking the girl if she's still there, to which she desperately tells him to turn on his phone. The confused protagonist starts searching, but she screams at him to hurry, frantic and worried. Finally, he finds the phone and, upon turning on the flashlight, discovers a terrifying scene. The girl was covered in the same type of leeches that had attacked them moments before. Both of them, scared, try to remove these things from the girl, who eventually falls unconscious after they manage to get them all off. Meanwhile, the protagonist watches as she continues to bleed. However, suddenly he starts feeling a bit dizzy as he realizes that those bugs had bitten him too, and he begins to collapse. He drops his phone and sobs against a wall, complaining that he can't bear this and not understanding why it's happening to him. Through tears, he begins to call his parents. Suddenly, he looks up and sees a light at the end of the train. He decides to carry the girl on his back and go to check what the source of the light was. As he moves forward, illuminating with his phone, he slowly sees the corpses of the people who were inside the train. Then he starts talking to himself, complaining that he doesn't understand all the weird things that are happening, from the darkness of this world to the train that fell from the sky. He tries to lift the girl to ask her all those questions, but he remembers that she told him to figure it out for himself. Then he starts to realize how hungry he is, while someone else seems to be watching from the darkness in the distance. Finally, he manages to face the source of the light, only to realize that it was the light from the train. Upon exiting, he could see two buildings that he recognized, so he assumed they were near Gangnam station. He deduced that apparently they were at war, but upon looking more closely, he realized that he couldn't see the buildings behind them. He knew it was dark, but he should still be able to see 1 or 2 buildings. He decided to go see, hoping to find some food. As he walked, he checked his phone and realized that the battery was running out. Then he realized that without light, the leeches could attack them again when there were no more lights. He decided to save his phone's battery and settle for the train's light, hoping it would be enough. After a few steps, he felt tired and stopped to rest for a moment. Then he heard knocking noises coming from somewhere. When he turned, our protagonist saw that it was a person hitting the train's light. He shouted and asked why they were doing that, and asked them to stop. This person just smiled and gave the last hit to the train's light. Our protagonist would wonder who that was and why they would break the lights, even thinking that maybe it was a demon, but realizing that in the end he couldn't see anything because everything had gone dark. At that moment, he would realize that those leeches were starting to climb up his leg, but he wouldn't know because he couldn't see anything due to the darkness, so he would start screaming in terror as these leeches slowly climb his body until they reach his lips. As he tried to get them off by moving around until he stumbled and fell into a place with water deep enough to fully submerge himself, thus managing to get rid of the leeches that had climbed his body and spitting out the ones that entered his mouth. As he emerged, he would realize that he was in water after getting rid of the leeches and start drinking. At the same time, he would complain that he is starving. After hydrating himself, he would realize that he lost the girl and start desperately searching for her. He would manage to find her cell phone in the process and plead for it to turn on, and upon successfully turning on the flashlight, he would see a pile of corpses in front of him. This almost made him vomit again, but he would compose himself and wonder where the girl was, telling himself that he had to find her. Then he would start searching with his flashlight in the area where he thinks he lost her. Finally, he would find the red jacket the girl was wearing, and he would apologize, saying that those bugs attacked them and that it was chaos. And while he was saying that, he thought that maybe she could still be unconscious, only to see her face and realize that it was completely disfigured after being devoured by those bugs. This would scare him, causing him to fall backward while screaming in terror. After this, he would be walking alone in the darkness, being miserable and sad, thinking that he was going to die at that moment. So he would stop walking and kneel down on the ground, crying on his knees, saying that he wanted to go home and see his mother again. At that moment, he would find a faucet where he would find several useful objects, first aid kits, an axe, and a flashlight, but no food. Upon careful inspection, he would find a map of the place he was in. Seeing this map, he would see that a supermarket was not far from him. Then, feeling more motivated, he would equip himself with a bag with the necessary items, the flashlight, and the axe, and he would start his journey again to reach that supermarket. But before leaving, seeing the corpse of the girl who had helped him, he would cover her with a cloth and apologize for what happened while crying and lamenting the loss. Using his new flashlight and equipment, he would start looking for the supermarket, taking advantage of the map and resources of the place he had just inspected. He would realize the places he had just passed and check out some new ones on the way. He would come across what seemed to be a newspaper that said 50,000 missing in the Seoul Daily. The news was 50,000 missing at Gangnam Station. The UN would report the incident Gangnam 811, the largest disaster ever to occur in Korea, and that the cause of this disaster cannot be seen because the rest of the newspaper was under debris. The protagonist would try to pull this newspaper to read the rest of the news. However, he would end up tearing it due to the force he applied because of the debris crushing the paper. Realizing that he lost the important part, he could only read that there is a shelter at the city hall, and that he could find other survivors there. At that moment, he would start hearing a noise coming from the building and would get up to keep walking, hoping that the building wouldn't start collapsing. Finally, he would manage to reach the supermarket where he would find food. But suddenly he would stop due to a mysterious sound around him that slowly approached him, until he realized that the source of that sound was a woman with a chainsaw approaching to kill him. But the protagonist quickly put his axe in the middle of the path so that the chainsaw wouldn't kill him, and started struggling with the woman who, with a terrifying smile, slowly managed to bring the chainsaw closer and closer to the protagonist's face. But luckily, some rubble fell on the woman's head, knocking her out and allowing the protagonist to escape from the woman and the chainsaw. With barely enough time to recover, he got up and started running as the building started to collapse. In the end, our protagonist would barely manage to escape, wondering why she tried to kill him and what that was, wishing that she's dead while saying that he can't stop shaking. At that moment, he would look at his hand and realize how lucky he is because he never let go of a packet of noodles he had unknowingly grabbed from the place. And he would start eating raw ramen, saying that it's good but it would be even better with seasoning. After finishing his food, he starts his journey to the shelter, saying that if he finds someone, maybe he could discover what happened in Seoul, and looking up at the sky, he wonders where the main street could be. Finally, he would arrive and find the broadcasting company building. Suddenly, he would see the light of a truck parked in the middle of the street, and that seemed to be in good condition. So he would get into the vehicle wondering if there is any food and accidentally finding the switch with which he would manage to turn on the lights that perfectly illuminated the main street he was on, relieving our protagonist who thought that now these bugs couldn't attack him. He quickly starts looking for a restaurant or a place that might have food. While walking, he would be thinking about how close he was to the Gangnam station where there were many language schools. But finally, he would be glad to have found a store. However, upon entering, he would find that there was nothing and it was completely empty, as apparently someone had already arrived first and taken everything. But upon further exploring the place, he would find the phrase at the end of the abyss, "Look to the sky," written on the walls, wondering what that meant. And upon closer inspection, he would notice that it would have been painted after the wall was broken, deducing that someone must have written it after the disaster, coming to the conclusion that another survivor had already been there and took all the food. Upon leaving the place, he would think about what the sign said about looking to the sky, and upon looking up, he would see nothing but darkness. Thinking that at least if it were night, he might be able to see the moon, so he would wonder what the hell happened. Also thinking about the train that fell from the sky. Turning to his left, he would realize that at the end of the street, it was still dark despite the powerful light around him. So he would start walking towards this darkness, scared as he approached closer and closer until he realized that it was apparently a dark wall. And upon reaching his hand, he would realize that he was completely blocked and wonder what it was. Desperate, he would start shouting, wondering how that could be possible, saying that he needed to get to Wangmun. By accident, he would tear that dark wall and realize that it was soil, seeing that the entire dark wall that surrounded him was soil. Looking around, he would see a hole where there was light, and thinking that if there was light, then there must be people, so he would start running in that direction. But he would quickly run out of road and begin to fall into an abyss. Managing to grab the edge at the last second, he would start asking for help, shouting if anyone was there, pleading for help while he hung from that cliff. Suddenly, those bugs that had killed the girl and climbed on him several times would start to appear again and slowly start eating his fingers, causing the protagonist pain. He would let go of the cliff. He would be surprised, wondering what had happened, as he thought she was dead. To which she would respond that it was not true and ask who had said that, and she would say that when they threw her to the ground and left, she woke up and barely managed to escape those bugs. She would also ask him if he was the one who turned on the light. Surprised, he asked who the dead girl was because she was wearing the same clothes as her. To which she would say that if he thought she was the only person wearing clothes like that and repeat the question about whether he had turned on the light. He would respond yes, so she would say to go and turn it off if he wanted to stay alive. He would thank her for saving him and being glad that she was okay, but he wouldn't pay her, which would surprise her. Then, the protagonist would demand that she tell him what happened in Seoul, and that he wouldn't do anything until he knew that. She, completely indifferent, would only turn and tell him not to do anything and to die on his own, which would surprise the protagonist. To which she would repeat that he should find out for himself and that she had no intention of taking care of him. So apparently he would jump on the girl, which would scare her. But he would shout "watch out," as it turned out that he had jumped on her to push her, as an animal had also jumped on her. He would ask her if she was okay and what that thing was, and when he saw it clearly, he would realize that it was a dog, but he couldn't see what kind of dog it was. Looking around, they would realize they were surrounded by dogs, to which the girl would say that's why she told him to turn off the light. She would say that they were dogs who had lost their owners and were looking for something to eat. She would say that they had been traveling in a pack and feeding on corpses, which is why they had become so aggressive. Then, slowly, she would say that when she gave the signal, they should run. So both would start running away from the pack of dogs. However, one would be close to catching up to the girl, so the protagonist would use his supply bag to hit the dog and save her. Then, another dog would start biting that supply bag and he would start struggling with these dogs while the girl shouted at him to be careful. Finally, in the struggle, the bag would break, and the door would signal the way they should run to close it and save themselves from the dogs. So he would ask if she was okay. Then she would start saying if she remembered the girl who had the same clothes as her and would say that maybe she was part of her class. She would start telling him that they were practicing a group dance for a competition, and that day they would all be enjoying the last days of their third year of high school. But then there was an explosion so loud that it seemed like their ears would burst. They saw a mushroom-shaped cloud appear near Mount Chongai, and when they woke up, it was all dark. The protagonist would be confused and ask if that had been a nuclear bomb, and ask if she didn't think that was a nuclear bomb. To which she would reply that if it had been a nuclear bomb, there would have been a nuclear blackout and they would have changed due to radiation. But that they are both healthy. The protagonist abruptly interrupted her, saying that if it had really been weeks, wondering if he had really been unconscious all that time. Upon reaching the top of the building, she would tell him that she couldn't trust him because he came out of nowhere saying he had been unconscious all that time, revealing that all of that happened 2 months ago, 62 days to be exact, which would surprise the protagonist, who would say he had only been asleep for a few minutes, which she wouldn't believe, saying she didn't trust him and that he could be on the same side as those lunatics, to which he would think she was referring to the chainsaw psychopaths. He would tell her she was wrong and that he wasn't one. Then, suddenly, earth would start falling from the sky, so the girl would shout for him to enter the building again. But when they reached the door, it would be blocked by a pile of earth that would interrupt them halfway. The protagonist, in panic, would ask why there was earth falling from the sky, while the girl looked into the distance, and then they both turned to see a tsunami of earth approaching where they were. Desperately, they tried to push the dirt to be able to cross the gate, but another pile of dirt would fall right on top of them to interrupt them. In this way, they could only watch as that giant tsunami of dirt slowly approached them. But then the girl would see a hole in the ground towards where they both ran to try to escape. Her mother was trying to wake up our protagonist, who would think that all that was a dream that felt very real while having breakfast. He heard his mother's complaints about how he and his father were using their phones too much during the meal, while on the television they talked about a possible disaster approaching Korea. After a while, we would see the protagonist with a friend talking about video games as they went to school. At school, we would see our protagonist having a common and normal life with his friends during classes. The protagonist would think that life sucks, wondering if it will get better in college, wishing to be accepted to finally be free, and thinking about possible ways to end the world, from a war to climate change or a meteorite. Later, during class, the teacher would be explaining a topic, but our protagonist would not be paying attention and would start to fall asleep little by little, only to open his eyes again and find himself on top of the girl, who would ask him if he was okay. The surprised protagonist would think she was the girl from the dream. Looking around carefully, he would realize that he had a piece of steel piercing his stomach, and then he would realize that it was not a dream. And because of the injury, he started coughing and, upon recovering, asked the girl if she was okay, to which she would say that he should stop worrying about him in that state and start moving because they were in an uncomfortable position. He would say that he can't because of his back and that if he moves his arms everything would collapse. Then, he would tell her not to worry. The girl would say that there was something behind her, but he interrupts her saying that he was scared. He would say that every day of his life he hoped something would change, but he didn't like the change that had happened with all the darkness and corpses around him. He thought that if he reached the shelter he would be rescued, but if 2 months have already passed, then it was probably destroyed and there was no hope. Then, he would ask the girl if he could reach into his left pocket, and upon checking, it would turn out that he had emergency food and would be giving it to her. He would tell her that she needed to survive no matter what, while in tears telling her that he didn't want to die while calling for his parents as the earth consumed them little by little. Finally, the girl would manage to reach a door behind her, so they would both fall to the lower floor. As they fell, she would say that she tried to tell him there was a door behind him, but he had started to cry. Then, she would go over the wound saying that there wasn't too much blood despite the pipe sticking into him, but that it wasn't too deep although it still needed to be taken care of. She would stare at the emergency food they had given her, but throw it away asking why she would eat the garbage and staring at him. She would say she would tell the unconscious protagonist to hold on, that she had medicine and food in her hideout, so she would help him and not let him die. Then, she would leave the building in the darkness and start to hear the barking of dogs. She would take a camera out of her pocket and start using night vision to move around the city. She would slowly walk through the city using the night vision of her camera and end up getting close to the pack of dogs. Using the zoom on her camera, she would see them to distinguish them well, and upon seeing them, she would start tiptoeing so as not to attract their attention. Just before stepping on a can that was in the middle of the road, she would suddenly stop for something she saw through her camera. She was listening to one of the crazy people in the city who were apparently in a group and were using corpses for something. They were using the corpses to eat them, and then one of the psychopaths would carry a corpse that would look a lot like the girl, which would scare and worry her. And while she watched from a distance, one of those psychopaths would start using the chainsaw to cut up the bodies they had for food. Suddenly, one of those people would appear in front of the girl's camera and start smelling the place, while the girl covered her mouth to make no noise and tried to move slowly to get away from that psychopath who would be sniffing around with a machete in his hands in search of the girl, who would accidentally move a can next to her, alerting the psychopath, who would quickly move his machete to kill the girl. She would narrowly manage to dodge him, but then the leeches would start crawling up her body. Slowly they would reach her face, and some would even reach her eyes. With tears in her eyes, she would silently await her apparent death with the psychopath's hands practically on top of her. But at the last second, the pack of dogs would detect the psychopaths, and a fight would ensue. In that moment, the girl would take the opportunity to remove the leeches from her body and escape the area. Once safe, she would think about how close she had come to death, and that it was not a good idea to leave the protagonist alone for too long. Then, she would begin to smell blood, wondering if she had gotten her period, but due to the darkness, she could not see. Annoyed, she would begin to walk towards her shelter. In the end, she would make it to the subway, which apparently had its entrance blocked until recently. But the earth that had fallen from the sky had changed the terrain, allowing her to walk through it. As she walked through the subway, using her camera, she could see a sign on the walls, painted letters forming the words "Go to the Sky." Wondering who had written it and realizing that it wasn't there before and that it was a recent painting. Thinking that there were no other survivors apart from herself, the lunatics, the boy, and the protagonist, wondering if there might be more people out there. Wondering if there were more survivors. Looking at the wall, she would see the words in the abyss painted on it. As she continued to move forward, she would eventually arrive at her shelter, which was filled with food and medicine. Seeing that she had some hemostatics and sutures, and with a photo of 3 strangers, she would think that she had sworn never to get close to anyone new again. After charging her phone, she would think that she needed more pads. As she checked her own body, she would realize that the smell of blood was not due to her period, and she would wonder what was causing it. Suddenly frightened, she would realize that she had a psychopath chasing her quickly with a machete. Luckily, she managed to dodge him with a leap, but she crawled on the ground in fear with no way to defend herself from the psychopath, who was approaching slowly. The girl just covered her mouth, telling herself to stay quiet. If the psychopaths found her, they would have won the fight, and the place where they were was a refuge for the blind. The psychopath who was with the girl started sniffing around, slowly getting closer until he was right in front of her, saying she should be there and preparing to attack right where she was. Quickly, she used a glass bottle to stun the psychopath and escape, taking her flashlight, and starting to search for all the emergency supplies she had before escaping. The psychopath slowly got up, shouting that the girl was going to die, asking where she was and saying he would eat her alive when he found her. The girl managed to escape her own shelter by pointing her flashlight outside, finding all the other groups of psychopaths walking towards her shelter. She quickly reacted by turning off her flashlight, staying still and silent while all the psychopaths walked by her, hoping they wouldn't discover her. One of the psychopaths started to notice her presence until the psychopath inside the shelter shouted at them to come in, saving the girl from being discovered. She fell to her knees and looked at her shelter, which was being set on fire by the psychopaths. This made her panic because all her food, medicine, and other resources she had managed to get were there. From a distance, she lamented seeing all her work starting to go up in flames and began to return with the few supplies she had managed to save, but with a lost gaze until finally stumbling upon something on the way and finding a rope hanging in front of her. She said she had no hope and wondered if she would die in pain. Perhaps if she died, she could finally be at peace by raising her gaze and seeing 3 other bodies hanging in the same place. Seeing this, she would start to cry, having memories of the photos that were set on fire in her base, which were set on fire in her shelter. After crying over this photo, she would wonder about the protagonist, saying that he promised her he wouldn't abandon her. She would proceed to take the hanging rope and suddenly hear a voice saying they feel sorry for her and calling her by her name, Hyul Shin. She, ignoring the voice, would start running quickly towards where she had left the protagonist, but upon arriving and pointing the flashlight to that place, she would find that he was gone. Wondering how and where the protagonist could have gone with the wound, he would suddenly appear behind her, asking her where she had gone. But she would turn around angrily, asking what was going on with him, to which he would respond that he was just walking around the area looking for food. And she would ask what happened to his wound, and he would say it was strange because when he had woken up, someone had already treated it. She would check his wound and see that it was already perfectly healed, which surprised even the protagonist himself. Then the girl would ask him what he was. The protagonist would not understand what she meant by that question and would say that when he woke up, the tube was already next to him and he thought she had taken it out, to which she would ask why she would do that. Then she would turn around and say she was sure and couldn't trust him, telling him to survive as he could. But the protagonist would ask her not to leave him. The angry girl would return and shout at him, telling him why she didn't trust him, saying it was impossible for him to be unconscious for 2 months and for his phone to still have battery after all that time. In addition to telling him that he doesn't even seem to notice the smell of all the corpses around him. The protagonist would only respond that he was congested, but all these things would make him think. He would say that if it really had been 2 months, how was it possible that he was alive and that he hadn't even charged his phone before leaving? Then he wondered where his house was, slowly starting to say things about his house, his family, and how he couldn't remember anything about it, until he finally realized that he didn't even know his own name. Suddenly, they would be interrupted by a sound coming from inside the building. There, they would see that it was the bag that had fallen from the protagonist during the fight with the pack of dogs, while the girl remembered the posters she saw on the walls. Suddenly, Haewoo would hear the movements of a person in an alley behind them, but upon shining the flashlight, there was nothing there. She would wonder what that was, to which the protagonist would say he saw nothing, also saying that the issue of the pipe and the wound was strange and that everything was a mess. The girl would think that apparently, the protagonist was not lying and there was no way he could have written all that. Then, the protagonist would say that maybe there was someone else alive, someone bigger than the two of them. After a while, both of them would be walking on the same path, traveling the same road. But the girl would shine her flashlight on the protagonist, telling him not to follow her. The protagonist would say that the path to the shelter was blocked and he couldn't remember anything about himself, asking if he could simply walk with her and wouldn't bother her on the way. He would ask her why Seoul was like this, but then he would stop saying that she told him not to ask any questions. But the girl would tell him that everything was related to a hole. He would start asking her questions about that word, about what she meant by the hole and if they were inside one, and would offer to carry her bag. Both would end up arriving at the subway station and the protagonist would ask why they had gone there. She would say that the path was blocked with dirt and they lost their food because of the psychopaths. If there was a way they could use to get to another place, it was the subway station. Suddenly, both heard the sound of a chainsaw in the distance. She would start thinking that the path could be even more dangerous than staying there, but he would hurry her because the sound of the chainsaw was getting louder and louder. Then, he would slip and fall into the station, so she would end up chasing him, falling on top of him. Both of them, then, walking through the subway station, would see the large number of corpses in the place and would end up being surprised by 3 psychopaths who were hiding there. So both of them would start running away from them. The protagonist would wonder how the psychopaths had infiltrated the subway station. While running along the tracks, they would reach a path that had been blocked by dirt, but right next to it they would see a door that was the exit. But while being there, they would realize they needed a password to open it. The protagonist would see that something was written on the sign that could be a clue for the password, and they would start desperately guessing the password without knowing that a tiger was waiting for them on the other side. The protagonist would start entering the password desperately, while the girl thought that the puzzle couldn't be so difficult, thinking about all the possible outcomes that Clue could have to get the password. Meanwhile, the protagonist would take an iron bar ready to face the psychopaths. But in the last second, the girl would manage to open the door and both of them would quickly enter and slam the door in the faces of the psychopaths, saving themselves from them. Once they were safe, the protagonist would ask the girl how she knew the password. But she would be terrified, looking at something else, the tiger that was waiting for them on the other side. Then, they would begin to try to open the door again to go to the other place, but a chainsaw would make a hole in the wooden door. The tiger, for its part, would quickly pounce on them. The protagonist would push the girl to one side and put his hands on the door, and would wait while he watched the tiger closely to open the door at the last minute. Then, we would see a flashback of Hae-Joel's school life, and a woman with a dead look would tell him to wake up and that he was now an adult who shouldn't sleep in class. While Hae-Joel cried, this girl would only tell him to get up. Suddenly, Hae-Joel woke up, and the protagonist would proceed to ask if he was okay, telling him what had happened. The girl would ask what happened and where the psychopaths and the tiger were. The protagonist would say that there was a big fight for a few moments, but then both of them went quiet, and they would wonder why there was a tiger there. The protagonist would ask if the girl could walk and would say that they would take advantage of being in a safe place and rest, but she would tell the protagonist not to touch her. Then, they would start walking down the hallway, and in the meantime, the protagonist would ask what the password was and how she figured it out, to which she would respond 1225, saying that it was an image, that if you looked at the numbers and the sides of the diagram, it was a Christmas tree. The protagonist, thinking a little about the number 1225, would say that it was starting to get a little hot there. Suddenly, they would both stop, seeing that at the end of that hallway there was a light. The protagonist would think that it couldn't be the light from the subway and that it was too hot, while the girl shared her thoughts, saying that where were the rescue team? That was what they thought, that no matter what had happened, there had to be people going to help them. But too much time had passed and no one came. Therefore, they came to the conclusion that maybe something was not right just in Gangnam, but maybe in the whole country. In the end, when they reached the end of that hallway, they found a lava pit right in front of them. Both of them were surprised and terrified to see the ocean of lava in front of them. They said they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The protagonist asked if that was lava and how it was possible, as there were no volcanoes nearby. She hushed him and said she was just as scared as he was, thinking about how it could be possible. If it was real, then what the survivors she lived with before predicted was also true. Suddenly, everything started shaking, and they could see debris falling onto the lava and splashing near them. This frightened the protagonist, who said that it really was lava. Haeul told him to move to get a better view of the area and think about how to solve the problem. As he looked out, he saw a path on the side of the lava pit and said they had to go that way. The protagonist rejected the offer, saying they could splash the lava. Then, she started moving forward, telling him to stay there and starve to death. The frightened protagonist started backing away, thinking he couldn't do that. But suddenly, he heard a thud behind him, and as he turned around, he saw something hitting the door they had closed moments before. Finally, he gave in and accepted to go on the path that the girl had told him, while telling her to wait for him. He wondered what had happened and how it could have happened in Gangnam. He also wondered if that was really the end. The girl pointed to the other side, where they saw a statue. The protagonist said it was the statue of Admiral Yi Sun Shin, but it was supposed to be in another city, so he didn't understand how it could have ended up there. The girl said there were buildings near the city, so everything must have floated from the statue's city to that same place through the lava. The girl thought that if she died, she could finally find peace and slowly began to slide towards the lava from where she was standing. The protagonist grabbed her and asked what had happened. It turned out that the girl had passed out and said there was a smell of sulfur and to be careful. The protagonist didn't understand what she meant by sulfur, but he would eventually come to the conclusion that she was referring to it. Then, another pile of debris started falling from above towards the lava, and the protagonist just proceeded to scream while covering the girl's body, praying that the lava wouldn't fall on them, begging for everything to stop and asking what he should do. Until finally, mentally exhausted, he asked to be killed. Then, upon opening his eyes, he saw that the steel wound from earlier had opened, causing him to bleed again. Then he would turn to his left, seeing that the tiger from earlier had finally caught up with them. Losing his composure, the protagonist would begin to laugh softly, thinking that it was all just a dream, and that if the tiger devoured him, his mother would wake him up. But before the tiger could devour him, a bang was heard, and upon opening his eyes, the protagonist would see the dead tiger in front of him with a hole in its head. Confused, he would turn to the side, seeing a figure in a gas mask with a rifle in the distance, who would leave after saving our protagonist. He would then start screaming desperately for help. Suddenly, more debris would begin to fall, and a small stone would hit the protagonist's head, making him react and think that if someone had saved them, there was still hope of finding more survivors. So he would place Haeul on top of him and start running to the other side of the collapsed road to jump at the last second, barely grabbing onto one of the steel bars. Then the masked figure would arrive in front of the protagonist, who would start asking for help. But he would apologize, saying that the stairs were collapsing and it was impossible to save both of them. So he would make our protagonist decide whether to save himself or her. Before responding, the protagonist, in tears, would ask him if all of this was a dream. But the masked man would only apologize again, saying that everything was real and predicted, and that if he died, it would all end. Then he would say that there was not much time left, asking what the protagonist would decide. Then we would see Haeul wake up on the ground after being unconscious, looking around and asking what happened and where she was, realizing that she was on the other side of that river. Looking around, she would see that the protagonist was no longer there, wondering where he had gone. Meanwhile, the masked man looking from afar would only say that he had no other choice and apologize, and as he walked away, he would think about how bad the situation of these children was because they were still alive, wondering what excuses the Disaster Prevention Committee would present this time. Meanwhile, Haeul would start screaming, asking the air and waiting for our protagonist to respond to where he was and where he had gone. Meanwhile, a pair of sneakers and a shirt would be lying in the lava. Then a flashback of Haeul. She was opening some curtains to see the sunlight. Then she would check her phone, where she would have a congratulatory message as she had been accepted to the University of Seoul, which would make her very happy. As she stepped out onto the street, the news would be talking about a topic related to the Disaster Prevention Committee of Korea, but everyone would be ignoring it. Meanwhile, Haeul would meet with her friends, who would be congratulating her for getting into the university. Then, in the distance, they would see another girl named Boram. One of Haeul's friends would say that Boram couldn't apply because the director's recommendation didn't arrive since she couldn't submit her assignment on time. In another flashback, it would be seen that Haeul had accidentally spilled a glass of water on Boram's assignment and apologized to her, but an angry Boram would tell her that was her assignment. Then, another of Haeul's friends would wake her up from that trance asking if she was listening. Then the other friend would tell them to look at something, a couple of trucks with the word Seoul Zoos. Already at school, Heejol's friends would be congratulating him for getting into that university, saying they were jealous since he wouldn't have to take any more exams. Meanwhile, behind another girl named Snob, she would tell them to lower their voices as she was trying to concentrate. Haeul would apologize and her friends would only say that Snob was always angry, as she was always below Heejol. As she went to another place, more people congratulated Haeul for getting into the university, and her friends would ask her to help them find university guys. Outside, everyone in red cheerleading uniforms or everyone in red uniforms preparing what looked like a rehearsal, they would see something in the distance. Wondering what it was, they would see a strange mushroom-shaped cloud in the distance. Then everything would turn dark. Then, Haeul would take her phone, turn on a flashlight app to see the place, wondering what had happened, where she was and calling around in case there was anyone. Then, she would manage to hear the voice of another person behind her. It was Boram, who was crying confused not knowing what had just happened. Asking what happened, Haeul would respond that she had no idea, as both lamented not knowing what was happening. A couple with their flashlight would find them asking who was there, thanking God for having found other survivors and realizing that they were high school students. The woman would hug the two girls to calm them down, while the man would say that the rescue team would arrive soon, sooner or later, and that they shouldn't worry, that they were together so that everyone could go home, that they would be okay, and that they shouldn't give up. After that, we would move to a scene where they all ended up hanging, as it seems that they had all agreed to do so. However, Haeul was afraid and didn't dare to jump, but in the end, she did so with fear in the last few minutes. But then she would remember the congratulatory message for getting into university, and think that she didn't want to die. She desperately grabbed onto Boram's body to not die, who would stare at her since she was still alive in those last seconds when Haeul clung to her to not die the same way. Saying that she couldn't die like that, she would start using Boram's body and the rope to climb and not die like her companions. Returning to the present, Haeul remembered all of this after also losing her new companion. Thinking about the protagonist and asking him to please come back, blaming herself through tears, saying she was sorry and please not to leave her alone again. While in her mind she was pursued by Boram's body. Elsewhere, the protagonist suddenly woke up, asking where he was and complaining of a headache. Looking around, he would see that the stairs were far below where he was, wondering how he got up there. Then he would realize that the girl was not with him, so he would start screaming Haeul's name, asking where she was and asking her to respond while he began to walk in search of her, while complaining about the pain from the freshly opened wound. In the end, he would manage to reach what seemed to be a tunnel in the side of that well, and would jump in. Inside, he would turn on the flashlight he had on his forehead to see the place, which had a wall covered in those leeches. The protagonist, scared, would turn his face to the side, hoping that these leeches would jump on him. But then he would realize that they were not attacking him and wonder if they were sleeping. When looking around, the protagonist would see that it was the only way out, seeing a very narrow hallway that they could pass through after exploring the entire tunnel. While complaining about the pain, they would say that they didn't want to go that way, but they couldn't die there and had to find Haeul. They would gather their courage and start walking down the hallway, trying to avoid touching any of the leeches. As they advanced, the protagonist would notice that the path was even narrower. They would think that they couldn't turn their neck and couldn't go back. They would wonder what to do as they kept moving forward. Then, as they approached, they would see that what made the path so narrow was a corpse stuck to the wall, devoured by the leeches. This would surprise and scare the protagonist. They would try to slowly pass the corpse, saying that they would manage to get out of there. Finally, they would succeed in passing it, but they would accidentally touch the wall with their foot, causing all the leeches to start climbing on them. This would scare them, and screaming, the protagonist would start running until they fell into a water well. They would manage to remove the leeches, but at the same time, they would run out of air. So they would start using the walls to climb and reach the surface. Upon reaching the highest point, they would encounter a stone ceiling and slowly start losing consciousness due to lack of air. In the last second, they would see a source of light that was too narrow to escape on their own. They could only pass their fingers through. Meanwhile, Haeul would be crying next to the protagonist's backpack. Then, she would hear a sound coming from somewhere, wondering what that was. It turned out that the protagonist managed to bring part of their face to the surface to scream for help. They would beg for help desperately. Haeul heard the screams and recognized their voice, asking where they were. She would start walking towards where she thought the source of the voice was, telling them to respond. She would end up arriving at a dark cave where she proceeded to turn on her flashlight to see inside. She would come face to face with what seemed to be Bram's head coming out of the shadows, telling her that she had deliberately ruined his task and that she knew it, insulting Haeul and telling her to go where she was. This would scare the girl, who would jump back in fright and drop her flashlight, starting to run away from the place. Meanwhile, the protagonist would desperately cling to whatever little ground he could grasp with his fingers, screaming for help desperately. Upon hearing him, Haeul would turn around, while the protagonist would finally lose all his strength and begin to fall and sink into the water. We would then see a conversation between Haeul and Oram, who were looking at the blue sky and saying they had never seen it so clear. They said it had been a long time since they had seen it so clear. Meanwhile, two other friends were talking about a photo. On the other hand, the protagonist was also with a friend saying that the exams were over and he loved his life. As they talked about how beautiful the sky was, saying that some days are worth living for, it turned out that that group of friends were all waiting at the same station. Returning to the present, Haeul would be running towards the location where the protagonist's screams were coming from and would reach his hand into the water hoping to rescue him. She would ask if he was there and for him to respond, begging him not to die. The protagonist, with his last bit of strength, could grab that hand and be pulled out of that pit with the help of Haeul, who would ask if he was okay with tears in her eyes and apologize, saying she should have come sooner. Meanwhile, the protagonist would tell her that he was just happy that she had rescued him and thank her. Then Haeul would begin to recite a poem from someone named Dongju, sky, wind, stars, and poem, saying that the sky represented hope. His message was that even in dark and difficult times, the sky was always there. The protagonist would ask why she mentioned all of that so suddenly, to which Haeul would say that she just wanted to see the sky again, that she wanted to get out of that dark place as soon as possible and look at the blue sky again. The protagonist would say he wanted something like that too. Then, suddenly, he would come to a stop, realizing he had just remembered his own name. Then, they would both be illuminated by several sources of light that blinded them for a few seconds. And it would be seen that they were some kind of police officers, and the one who seemed to be in charge would ask who they were, asking if they were civilian survivors, saying that was ridiculous and they couldn't have any more survivors at this point, ordering his soldiers to kill them. The protagonist would stand in front of Haeul and at that moment would begin to remember the posters he saw all over the city with the words "Look towards the distant sky, reach for the distant sky," and finally say that his name was Haeul. Looking closely, Haeul would see that they were police officers, thinking that they were saved and shouting to get their attention. The protagonist would take Haeul's hand and say that something was wrong and to look to the side, while saying that it seemed that the police officers didn't want them there. On that side, they could see a pile of corpses that seemed to have bullet holes in them. Then the police officers would get into position to shoot Haeul and the protagonist, and without wasting time, both would receive a gunshot. Haeul in the stomach and the protagonist in the chest, causing both to fall dead to the ground. At that moment, our protagonist Haeul would have a memory where a man in a white coat would tell him not to give up. And it turned out that this was his father telling him that he was sorry while putting a mask on his face. Meanwhile, the one in charge of the police officers would tell his men to make sure both were dead, to which the police officer would respond affirmatively and start approaching them with a companion. Meanwhile, in the distance, the same masked subject would be aiming his sniper rifle, preparing to shoot. And then giant debris would begin to fall from the sky, falling right between the two police officers who had gone to check if the two boys were dead and the other army of police officers. The army of police officers, for their part, would start climbing into a car, shouting to be careful and to head back to the third bunker. But then a second mountain of debris would fall right over the vehicles that were going to transport them and begin to fall. And one of the falling debris would end up on the lights of one of the trucks, leaving everything in darkness again. The high-ranking police officer would start shouting for everyone to stay calm and maintain their position, while the police officers desperately searched for light and flashlights, which they would eventually manage to obtain. When they turned on the flashlights, they would see a tiger in front of them with its entire mouth covered in blood, and it would quickly jump at the police officers. One of them, who had not been attacked, some police officers would start running away from the terror of the tiger, while one holding a flashlight would be paralyzed with fear. But when he turned with his flashlight, he could see that 3 other tigers were approaching the area, and then the tigers would start devouring all the police officers. Meanwhile, our protagonist, almost dead, could only hear these sounds as more debris from buildings continued to fall in the area, leaving everything completely dark. So, our protagonist would quickly get up from a stretcher with his body covered in bandages and his wounds healed, gradually getting back on his feet. He would start looking around, wondering where he was, and seeing food and water on a table next to him. He would start eating and drinking desperately, then saying he felt much better. Then he would start wondering where he was and how he got there, realizing at the last minute that Joel was not with him and wondering where she was. As he turned around, he would see what seemed to be some kind of secret files, but before taking them, he would see a curtain in front of him and say that something was wrong and he could feel it. Upon getting up and pulling the curtain back to see what was on the other side, he found the corpse of a man, apparently a doctor, who had been dead for some time due to the smell. And this would relieve him, as he thought this corpse could be Joel's, and he would start thinking if he was the owner of the bunker. But upon looking at it closely, he would see the label on its pocket with the name Kang, thinking it couldn't be possible, realizing that it was his father and starting to scream desperately. Meanwhile, outside that bunker, the person with the mask would say that he was finally awake, and that, as he thought, our protagonist was Dr. Kang's son. The person with the mask, for his part, would throw a fire stick at a pile of corpses, and as he watched them, he would say that he knew what it was like to follow orders, but that it was not right to treat civilians like this. As he coldly told those corpses to rot in hell, he lamented that he couldn't save the girl, seeing that Joel was among this pile of corpses that were being incinerated. As he caught fire, his body would begin to turn over, staring fixedly at his dead eyes. The protagonist would only weep over his father's corpse, lamenting his death. After this, he would sit next to him with a lost look, but then he would wonder where Joel was. Upon looking closely at his father's body, he would see that his mouth had something strange in it, so he would stand up and take a closer look. He would see that he was apparently biting something. So, while apologizing to his father, he would put his fingers in his mouth and pull out what seemed to be a piece of paper. Wondering what it was, he opened it and saw the words Severance Hospital, VIP Room, number 4 written inside. He would wonder why his father had that in his mouth and ask his father's corpse if he was hiding it. The protagonist would recount that since then he stayed in the bunker waiting, as he knew it wasn't his father who brought him there, as he seemed to have been deceased for much longer. But even after 2 weeks, no one appeared. After a while, he would have started to think about whether Joel was okay and that she had to be alive. All of this while showing us the pile of incinerated corpses. For his part, the protagonist would have started to explore the bunker, put on some clothes, and apparently read a report. Some papers that claimed to be the results report of the radiocarbon investigation of Mount Buchan granite. Having found clothes that fit him, he would fill a supply bag, thinking that would be enough. He would wear his uniform just in case, and a flashlight with batteries. Then, he would look at the paper in his hand, the paper he had taken from his father's mouth. He would speak to his father's corpse, saying that he would go to see that place and find out why he was hiding that in his mouth. Before leaving, he would cover the body with some sheets. Then, finally with his flashlight, he would leave the bunker and start walking, shouting for Joel, asking if she was there and saying that she must be alive. Meanwhile, unaware, he was being chased by one of the psychopaths. But when he turned around, he would see nothing, so he would keep walking, thinking that everything was fine and that he was just imagining things. But it would be better if he hurried. Meanwhile, the psychopath would start chasing him in the darkness with a knife in his hands, and behind him, 2 other psychopaths with a machete and a chainsaw. Slowly but surely, more and more psychopaths would start to accumulate behind the protagonist, chasing him slowly without him realizing it. But then he would stop when he saw what looked like a video camera on the ground. When he turned it on, he realized it worked, so he would leave his flashlight on the ground and say that the camera's night mode was much better, saying that it would help him find his way around. And the first thing he would see was a station, Yeoksam Station, saying he was still close to Gangnam. When he looked closely at the camera, he would see that there was a video on it. In the video, he could see Yeol bleeding and crying, asking if anyone was there and asking for help. In the same recording, he could hear a second voice of someone laughing, saying that Hyul was tough, that she had survived all of that, and asking where the other scoundrel who was with her was. To which she would reply that she didn't know, so the protagonist would ask who was recording that video, and who it could be. The second voice in the video would say that they couldn't let Hyul leave alive and ask her if she wanted to know why. To which she would respond that no one was going to leave there alive because people outside think everyone there is already dead. That they were shocked when they arrived there. They couldn't believe there were so many survivors even months after the accident. She would complain that survivors kept appearing even after the accident, after getting rid of them one by one. And now children like her, the protagonist would listen carefully to every word as the person in the recording would say they would tell him something interesting. That people thought no one knew this was going to happen in Seoul, but that wasn't true, as they had been training for this for 2 years, saying that if there was any threat to national security, they had been trained to eliminate the survivors, asking her to please die, because if she didn't die, she couldn't go back up. Our protagonist lamented what he saw in the recording and screamed for Hyul, which alerted the armed psychopaths, who lunged at him. Suddenly, everything turned dark, and when it lit up again, the corpses of the psychopaths were seen around the protagonist, with fists covered in blood and a look full of hatred and tears in their eyes. Hyul, agitated, brought her hands to her face and saw that they were covered in blood, not remembering what had just happened. Elsewhere, a girl used her cell phone and flashlight to loot the area, wondering what that noise she just heard was, as she seemed to have heard something saying it wasn't good and that she should leave. Upon reaching what could be her base, she says she managed to get something that could last up to 2 weeks. After leaving the place she just looted, the girl says she managed to get something that would last another 2 weeks, but then hears a noise behind her, so she hides behind a wall. It turns out to be one of the psychopaths wearing a white coat and murmuring something. After the psychopath leaves, the girl wonders where her husband is, thinking he might be dead and wondering what the hell she was murmuring. Finally, the girl manages to reach her home, where she greets her parents, looks at a photo, and starts preparing a dish of food that she takes to a bed where apparently a girl is lying. The girl says that she hasn't cried today and that she has been a good girl, to which the flashlight girl responds that she has been good. The girl says that everything is dark and scary, but she hasn't cried anyway. The girl congratulates the girl, telling her that she found some sweet corn and telling her she needs to eat something. While feeding her, the girl begins to cough, worrying the flashlight girl, who asks her what's wrong and gives her water. But the girl keeps coughing, and the girl realizes that she is coughing up blood. The girl asks why she turned off the light, to which the girl responds that it was too bright. In a reassuring tone, the girl tells the girl that they need to clean her mouth, and tearfully says that mom and dad will scold her for making a mess every time she eats. Later, the girl is huddled in what appears to be a hallway, crying over the situation she has to live with, looking at her cell phone and asking mom and dad what she should do while reading old messages from a conversation she had with her mother. Later, the girl would be using a computer that would be powered by a car battery. She would remember seeing something on a show and wonder which episode it was as she searched for it on the computer. Finally, she would find it. The girl would then see what appeared to be a series of doctors explaining that it was only tuberculosis from living in unsanitary conditions, and that coughing up blood didn't always mean you were going to die. Then, the girl would start to notice several medicines that she needed: isoniazid, rifampin, pyrazinamide, and ethambutol. Before leaving, she would go to the girl and tell her she was leaving and she should stay still and not cry. The girl would only say that she didn't want her to go and that she was scared. The girl would say that it's okay since her uncle was protecting the house, but she would come back soon anyway. The girl would tell her to come back soon. The girl, outside the house, would point her flashlight in front of her and say that she was going to get some medicine for Jiol, and that she should take care of the girl for her and thank her. This flashlight was pointing at the body of a man who had been crushed by rubble. Then she would start walking towards the hospital, and when she arrived, it would be seen that the name of this hospital was Severance Hospital. Inside, there was a white-coated psychopath walking through the dark hallways talking about her baby while holding a surgical saw in her blood-covered hands, saying that she needed to find a heart for her baby. While in another room there were a lot of corpses of people with their chests uncovered and a hole where their hearts should be. The girl, in front of the hospital, would see that the light on her phone would start to fail. She would wonder if her battery was running out or if maybe it was the application. Thinking that she should have brought more. She should take care of her sister, but she had to take care of her battery. As she took a step, she would end up stepping on something soft on the floor, hoping it was some kind of jelly and saying she had to hurry. Meanwhile, the thing she had just stepped on would open its eyes. Then the girl would arrive at a kind of sign that would be a map of the hospital. She would complain that the light wasn't turning on properly and wonder where she should go. She would decide to go to the children's hospital part, saying that she should be in the back after turning left and realizing she had arrived thanks to a giraffe drawing on the wall. She would try to push the door to enter, but would realize it was closed. Thinking that maybe there was someone inside, she would start screaming, asking if anyone was inside and trying to get the attention of whoever was there while shouting for help. These screams would be heard by the psychopath who was inside the building. Later, after a while, she would stop and wonder if there was another way to enter. But then she would see something beside her and start pointing her flashlight, only to find a truck that said Seoul Zoo, wondering why these trucks were parked at the hospital and why there were so many. As she explored the place without realizing it, a gorilla would stand behind her, but then the light on her phone would go out. Annoyed, she would manage to turn her phone on again and realize she was standing in front of the cage of a dead bear, wondering what the hell it was doing there. As she continued to explore, she could see more cages with dead animals inside, such as a lion or some zebras, as well as a few monkeys. She told herself that there were many of them and wondered why they were there. Among one of those cages, she would see a tiger, and next to this cage she would see the psychopathic woman who was inside the hospital. However, the girl would not see her in time and, worried, she says she should check outside, as it could be another survivor. She would start walking slowly towards the place, but suddenly she would hear a sound coming from behind her, but she would not be able to see what it was. So she would continue on until she reached an automatic door that led to the children's hospital, which luckily was open. Waiting and saying to herself that there had to be someone there, she would start calling out in the place and asking if anyone was there, begging them to please save her little sister. But unbeknownst to her, the psychopath would be standing behind her, ready to hit her in the head, pushing her to one side of the room with the blow. While the psychopath with the blood-stained bat would say that she had to save her baby, and a baby inside a capsule would be shown to us, it would turn out that the baby inside this capsule would be dead, but connected to the hospital machines. The psychopath would only repeat that she had to change her baby's heart, fluttering the bat around, trying to catch the girl who would manage to escape. Screaming, she would start asking where her baby's heart was, while the girl would be intercepted by another person wearing red clothes, who would cover her mouth and tell her to stay still. This person would turn out to be a girl very similar to Haewol in her clothes. Meanwhile, the other girl would wonder who was holding her, while the girl resembling Jael would tell her to stay still and be quiet. At one side of them, the psychopath asked where the girl was, slowly approaching from the other hallway. Then, the girl resembling Haewol would say that she was going to distract the psychopath, and that the girl should run. At that moment, the girl in red would start running, making noises in front of the psychopath, managing to get her attention, making her yell at her to stop. The girl on the phone would wonder who the girl in red was, saying that she looked her age. Then, she would put her head on her knees while complaining of the pain from a wound, as it kept bleeding while she complained of dizziness. But then she would start thinking about her little sister, wondering what she should do. And with that, she would gather the strength to stand up again and try to search for medicine no matter what. With her little strength, she would manage to take her phone and start walking through the hospital. As she took a few steps and saw the drawings around her, she would realize that she remembered this place. She remembered being there with her mother. Then we would see a memory of a girl calling out for Nara, who apologized for being late. The girl named Nara would wonder what held her up. Then a memory would start in this hospital of someone calling out Nara's name and apologizing for being late. There we would see the girl on the phone named Nara complaining that she had been delayed for so long, and that she had to leave because it was late for something. Her mother would only tell her that the line was too long and would ask her daughter Nara to go get some medicine for her, as her mother would be taking her little sister Jial to the blood analysis room. For her part, Nara would only call her mother a liar, since she had told her that she would take her shopping and reproached her for only caring about Yule, saying it was as if Nara wasn't even there. Her mother would only scold her, saying she shouldn't play with her phone while talking, but she would tell her that she had to catch up with the girls. Her mother would tell her that the pharmacy was in the main building, asking her kindly to go, but Nara would say she didn't want to and would complain to her sister saying that she was always sick. Then suddenly, the whole place would start shaking and everyone would wonder what that noise was and what was happening. Meanwhile, the woman would only ask for Nara and Jial, asking if they were okay. Then, everyone would say that something was happening outside and would go out to ask what had happened, only to find a big hole that had formed in front of them and was starting to be surrounded by a crowd. Returning to the present, we would see Nara standing in front of that same hole saying that it all started with it. that she remembered it, and that it was all the fault of that hole. Then suddenly, an arm would come out of that hole, scaring Nara and making her step back and scream in fright, being heard by the doctor who would start heading towards it. But on the way, she would stumble upon a wallet that had been dropped on the ground, and inside she would see a photo of Nara and Jiao, along with an identification and an address. And that's how the first part of this manhwa ends. If you've made it this far in the video, let me tell you that you've been one of the few people to get here. So comment the word darkness in the comments. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss any videos. That being said, see you in the next video.